Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for another episode of Deep Random Talks. Today, with myself, I have Roxana, my co host, and Alice, our guest, and we're going to talk about what Alice is building, which is pretty cool. But before we get us started, I would like to get to know Alice a little better. So, thanks for being with us, Alice.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great.
Of course. So I'm going to ask you a few rapid fire questions just for
Mhm.
our audience to get to know you a little better and icebreaker. So where do you live? Is that where you call home? What's something interesting about it?
Yeah, so I live in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood called Crown Heights. It is where I call home. Something interesting about it. Um, it is part of a New York City, obviously, but we're about 15 minutes from Prospect Park, and it's sort of like a lower key vibe if you have some notion of New York in your mind.
I see. So is it like more of a quiet kind of neighborhood? Um,
It's not quiet, but it's not like skyscrapers. They're mostly
I
brownstones, and you can walk to a really big green space easily. But then I live on a street that has like lots of bars and restaurants and stuff to
see.
do. So best
Yeah.
of both for me.
My imagination of anything related to New York City is like 600 miles an hour kind of pace
Right.
of everything.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, well, I know you're very busy with Recollect, obviously, but do you have anything interesting on the side going on? Any interesting books, side projects?
No interesting side projects at the moment. I've been spending all of my energy on Recollect, and yeah, it is a whole journey, as you know, getting startups off the ground.
Definitely. All right, great. I've been experimenting a lot with Ethiopian coffee recently because I like coffee, and I moved to a neighborhood that is close to a lot of Ethiopian, I guess, folks, and
Yeah.
there are a lot of restaurants and coffee shops, and they have a lot of cool things. So,
Cool.
okay, so you're at the dinner party,
Mhm.
and the great aunt is like, Alice, what is it that you do again? What's the answer?
Yeah. So for folks that are not sort of in this space, what I tend to say is I'm building this bridge. I'm building some sort of extended mind for people. So as technology advances and the machines get better at doing things, I'm building a way for people to use that as their own extended mind. So if you're thinking about something, you can kind of outsource some of that to the machine, but it can also act as an extension of your thinking.
Okay, beautiful. I do need that. Um, so let's go back. So your background is cognitive science, is that right? Like, take us back there. Like, what did you study? What was your thesis about? And what was parts of that you think set you up to build Recollect now?
Yeah. So I did a PhD and a postdoc in cognitive neuroscience, and I actually was more focused on vision. This was actually I finished my PhD in 2013, so it's 10 years ago now. Um, and back then, I was really focused on how people summarize scenes as a way to make that like computationally tractable. So as you walk through the world, you actually automatically grab the average size, average spatial frequency, actually average facial expression as well of people as a way to do this fast compute and help you to navigate the world. And I was really interested in this idea of a sort of resource constrained system being your mind, and how do we actually deal with the amount of data that's in the world that's coming into our perceptual system. So my focus was mainly on that. I looked at it in lots of different ways. I looked at the underlying brain mechanisms behind it. I looked around whether it was automatic or not, and that work was really, really interesting. I think if I continued in it, I would have focused a little bit more on like prototype formation. How do we have these prototypical things in our minds? Do we learn those over time with these rapid summaries? But I did not stay in academia, so I left after my postdoc, and actually worked at Yahoo for a little bit right after that, which is very interesting.
Okay.
Probably.
So, if I understand correctly, you were working on topics around how our brain perceives the world, and how it navigates and how it creates mental images. I think that that's what you mean by prototype. Roxana, is that roughly the stuff that you also worked on?
Yeah. So, well, when I say prototype, I mean kind of like physical, tangible,
Mhm.
um, you know, mock-ups of a product or a service. But putting back my cog side hat on, then I guess I would think of that as a mental model.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm still interested in this idea of how do we have mental representations of things that are really complicated? How do we store that in an efficient way that doesn't overwhelm us? Because we can't store every apple we see.
Yeah.
That would be exhausting.
Okay, so after your PhD postdoc, you worked at Yahoo. Was that related to your PhD work, or was it just completely different?
It wasn't directly related. This is back in, I think, 2014. And so in tech in general, there was this idea of a data scientist, but it wasn't terribly well formed. It was a lot of folks like me who were scientists in general. And then I had been doing machine learning work in my PhD back in like 2010. And so um, that back then it was like support vector machines. But there were a lot of transferable skills. And the person that I ended up working with at Yahoo was great. She was also an ex academic. And she allowed me to work over like multiple parts of the business, which I realized much later wasn't super typical. So I worked with the design team, I worked with user research, I was a data scientist for the mobile apps. And on top of that, they were really excited about having somebody that understood visual cognition because they were in the business of creating these visual displays that helped people, get the right content at the right time. And so, yeah, they were very excited about having a vision scientist on board. So I got to do some of that stuff still.
Okay.
I'm curious. I teach at the college, and I'm still connected. I'm an adjunct professor at Carleton. I closely work between industry and academia, and I still have a lot of cog sci students struggling with how did they make the jump. And you mentioned, it was transferable skills, and sometimes it's hard for them to pinpoint what's actually valuable in industry. So if you can kind of pinpoint some of those things, I think
Yeah,
that would be great.
absolutely. And in the decade or so since, I've helped lots of people make that transition. Friends and old colleagues and such. The biggest things I think are learning to program. So it depends. Cognitive science is a really broad field. I was doing more of the cognitive neuroscience end, so I was doing a lot of like sensors and fMRI and things like that. So it was a little bit more on the coding side. That really helped me, but I was doing it all in MATLAB at the time. And that wasn't transferable at all. I actually had to take my tech tests in Octave, I think, because I didn't know another programming language really. So Python, I would really recommend if students can just, do some of their work in that. The data analysis packages now are so much in that I feel like that's an easy win. The other piece in terms of more transferable skills, I would say, yeah, it really depends on like what exactly they're working on. The more you can edge into computational work, the more you can have that programming skill set. I think that's more, I guess, obvious to people when they're doing the hiring. If you can say, "Oh, I did this or that," I would say side projects, but I know PhD and postdocs like they don't have time to do lots of side projects. They're already working a million hours. So the other thing I would say is make those connections to people that Like I had this person that I worked with actually at Berkeley before I went to my PhD program. So I'd known her for a long time, and it was helpful for me then to say, "Hey, I'm going to leave my postdoc. You're working in industry. Like, can you help me navigate the situation?" So that's sort of like the start to do more networking, as it were, than you would think of as an academic. And then, yeah, definitely I would pick up Python and do some machine learning, although that whole field has changed so much in the last 10 years that, you know, you don't have to do the really low level stuff anymore.
Thank
Okay.
you. That's really valuable. That's been my approach too, and part of it. And I've noticed that there's more and more adjunct professors who work full time in industry.
Mm-hmm.
So take any independent study or any courses that you have as an elective with someone who's already fully embedded in industry, that served as a great bridge. Just following those in between.
And there are, like, I know at NYU there's a data science and cognitive science kind of mixed program-ish. There's at least people that have dual appointments. And so now that there's a real discipline behind this, behind like this title of data scientist, or now it's machine learning engineer, I guess. But finding those people within a university, like you're saying, that it like kind of have one, they're doing both, is super helpful. Yeah.
All right. So you transitioned from academia to industry and initially worked at Yahoo for
Mhm.
about a year. And then you went on to do a few corporate jobs after that, various roles, and, increasing authority and responsibility. Um, and eventually in 2020, you became an on deck fellow. Was that before you came up with Recollect idea, or was it after? So what's the causal order?
Yeah. So when my last, I like to say like full-time other gig, I was working at Cloudera with a group called Fast Forward Labs. Um, and our work there was around kind of predicting what would be commoditized or everyone would be using in machine learning in the next 18 months to 2 years. And then we would create prototypes with it, we would write reports, and we would work with lots of companies to help them implement that. So back then, lots of deep learning stuff in like 2016, 2017. And as I was making the trend, like I knew I wanted to start a company. I knew I was ready. I'd done, like you said, these various corporate-ish roles. I'd taken on lots of responsibility. I felt well trained to go ahead and start my own company. I was looking at what was going to be changing, what was already changing. At that point, we had just written a report actually around, language learning, transfer learning. We'd done like a whole workup on Elmo and Bert. So I knew some of this stuff was afoot. I think more than people outside of the space in general. And my first idea actually was much broader. And I left at the end of 2019 to pursue that. And I thought I would give myself a couple months of runway to work on that. I had put a basic prototype together. The first idea involved wearables, and so that was a big hurdle. Thinking about starting my own company as a first-time founder, and bringing in this like deep tech angle with the machine learning piece and the hardware. It all seemed fine and tractable. And then in March, obviously, of 2020, everything went on its head. And that was right around the time where I was feeling confident that I had a good idea. I had started to apply for the NSF SBAR. So I'd gotten through like the first phase of that process for the applications. In the US, we have a grant for small businesses. So NSF will fund things that are not purely research, they're really applied, but you can basically get non-dilutive funding to do that. So that was my plan at the time. Was I'd done the like first phase of this, there are two phases, and then I was going to do that. When the pandemic hit, I took a step back and thought about, okay, what's the likelihood that I raise capital? What's the likelihood of building a business with hardware right now with the supply chain issues? And what is like the problem I actually want to be solving? Is it the hardware piece, or is it really something else? So I did some reflection. I joined on deck as their first remote cohort. So they had been mostly in the Bay Area before that. I was still in New York. And they reached out to me actually, and they weren't quite as well known at the time. So I was sort of like, I guess, like I'm in my house anyway. I'm desperate to meet people. I was looking for a co-founder also. That was a big thing. And I realized how hard that was going to be in basically lockdown here in New York. So I joined on deck at that point, and by then I was already pivoting and shifting this to be really purely software to start with.
So was the original idea that you were working on starting 2019 Neural Cipher? Is that the hardware company?
Yeah, so Neural Cipher was an LLC I formed to do that work, basically. And so I used that as a way to do some consulting work, as a way to like build these things as like some entity. I'm impressed you. Oh yeah, it's on my LinkedIn. I was like, where did you find it? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. So that's one of the things that I like to ask our guests, which is you implicitly mentioned and passed, but I want to double click. So, what is the problem that you want to solve? What is the change you want to see in the world? Like at that reflection point when you sat down and thought it yourself, what did you decide at the end of it? Even though it might not be what you're working on now, but at that point, what was the change you wanted to see?
Yeah, and it for me, I think it's been similar throughout. Actually, like when I left Cloudera, um, it was an effect. It maybe a side effect of a lot of work I've been doing with organizations. But I saw what was happening in machine learning, which was that we were automating a lot of people's work away. This was accelerating over time, obviously, as it got easier and easier to do that. But most of what people wanted to do with machine learning and data stuff was reduce cost, automate workflows that they didn't think people needed to do. But I had sat with those people and interviewed them and understood their workflows and understood, like, okay, how do we take this workflow and turn it in, like, how do we use machine learning at different points in this to speed it up or to automate parts of their work. And in that, what struck me so deeply was that these people that were doing these jobs, like maybe their jobs would be automated away eventually, but they were incredibly creative. Like they had so much information in their heads. None of it was digitized. They knew, some people had been at the companies that they were at for like 30 years and they knew everything. They knew like where everything was. And it was, at once, like, you sit down and you're like, this is futile. We're never going to be able to automate all this. This is not, there's no data for it. And on the other end, I felt really hopeful that the thing I wanted to do was to augment that creative thinking. That, like, if you can equip people with this ability to do the creative thinking, it's already natural for them to be doing this. But if you can help them do that in an easier way, then I think we allow them, a better shot in this new space that's being created. So that was part of the original idea, was a wearable that would be tracking your sort of attentional state and your emotional state. And I had studied attention a lot and had friends that were still in academia doing this kind of work with EEG. So I knew that was possible to do that. And then, can we take the information you're consuming and also encode that with that state? So if we think about like models that we use to personalize things now, we get like, how much time did you spend on the page? Did you scroll? Like we have all of these metrics. And so for me, the biometric data was really like one level deeper for that. And for creative thought work, you need to be in a reasonable affective state. So you can't be super sad or super anxious. And you also need to let your mind wander. So you can't be really focused, which is really antithetical to the way that a lot of things are designed today because of the incentives around, advertising and these models around like, let's make you super, super focused. Actually, to do creative work, you need to be able to relax and let your mind kind of wander around. And so the original idea was around like, can we take this biometric data, understand when your mind is starting to wander? Can we let that be okay, right? Can we record the stuff that you're seeing in the world? You don't have to be hyper vigilant about attending to it. Store that information in a way that respects that. So like, you didn't really read this very well, you skimmed it, or like you were in a Zoom call and like you zoned out. That's fine, I think. But then start to differentially store that information and then bring it back when you want to do the creative work. So a big blocker sometimes to doing that creative work was this interruptive workflow that I saw people do, in these huge organizations where they're like, oh yeah, what this and this, and then they're like, okay, I have 17 clicks and I'm going to do this other thing. And then, there's so many pieces of software, there's all this stuff. So at a basic level, that really carried through for me. And so Recollect ended up being in my mind, like the first piece of that. Can we build using just software, using just the machine learning models? Can we start to build that connected system of information, bringing in some notion of attention in the metrics that we already have, but can we have that ready? And then I think the hardware at some point really will happen. And I don't have to build that piece. And so I want to be ready for it. I want to know how to smartly integrate those data types, but I don't need to be the one to like build the hardware pieces. And I actually advise a company that does build this EEG wearable system. So that's like a great way for me to keep abreast of how that field is changing too.
So as a embedded in academia researcher, like I've been part of fMRI studies. I can understand how that happens in in isolation in a very controlled environment. But as a practitioner, I've recently tested an app that uses biometric data. It integrates with Fitbit, and it was supposed to kind of detect stressful situations. And well, it kind of kept beeping at me on the highway on the way to Toronto every 2 seconds, asking me if I'm stressed and responding to it, and further aggravating. So I guess what I'm wondering, and I know this is a bit different, but how do you test in the real environment and you already mentioned the disruptions of flow, but I guess what are the ideas to kind of test that concept in real life without having an fMRI or a full-blown EEG machine and sitting without moving like the good old days?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think the alerting pattern. So it's called. I mean, like people think of these as loops, right? So you have like a closed loop system where you've got the wearable, you've got the biometric data, you've got the real data, right? And it's all kind of coming through, and then you can start to alter people's behavior that way and say, maybe you're not paying attention, or like they do this for long range truckers. Actually, I think it's already been implemented a while ago, where they'll wear something that's like, hey, you're falling asleep, and like that's really really important to keep somebody awake then. But it's very tricky to do that well, and I think we have that examples of that in software as well, where we get notifications or something is trying to like push our behavior in a certain direction because it knows something about what we're doing. And so I think with any product, wearable or not, where you have those notifications, it can be really frustrating when they come at the wrong time. So that part is incredibly difficult. I think that it's an art, really, more than a science of figuring out what is the sweet spot where it's helpful but not annoying. And I think you can test that. You can have people have the ability to shut the thing off, right? Like if you're driving, or have something about your state, like what are you doing right now? Let's get a little smarter about like what's happening. If you're driving, yeah, you're probably stressed. Like people are like you're like a high arousal state. You want to be in that state though. You're driving. Like you're not sitting at your computer. You don't really want to be in that state when you're trying to like chill and work. So I think it's important to take those things together in that to make sure that you're not creating something that's super distracting. There was another piece to your question, I think, though.
I think that was the biggest one. Like, how do you kind of test it in the real environment? And I think it's your answer made me think. So the whole concept of creativity, right? Like that kind of feeds into the notification itself. Like most times we have a beep, we have something very disruptive, but something I've been working on recently, there's alternatives to that, right? Like you can have sensory ones, which the
Yeah.
body responds and your brain responds very differently to
Mhm.
compared to a loud beep, right? The interruption is totally different.
Yeah, and they're different attention mechanisms, right? So if we have this exogenous like alerting system that short circuits to go to your amygdala, it's like loud noise, bright light, flashing, like there's danger happening. That is like the surest way to notify. Like they got the notification, and that's in part how some of these notifications work now. That I'm always silencing on my computer, where it's like this Slack one is my least favorite because it's like it's like a big knocking sound, and I'm like ah. But you're right. There are more subtle ways you can do it, and there are different kinds of attention you can lean on, right? Like if it's in the task you're doing and something changes subtly, that isn't sort of more of this like endogenous, like top down attention, really. But you can get closer to that than the like flashing emergency lights kind of situation.
Yeah, I definitely want to get further down in the UX, topics, especially around sort of attention architecture and nudging systems, especially the ones that don't prey on our systems that used to work to alert us about this tiger that was getting close to us, right? Like the ones that are a little more gentle. But one of the things that you mentioned was that you dropped the whole hardware thing because of the complexity and moved on to a software only system. And the problem that you were trying to solve was all this sort of implicit knowledge that people had in their head. They kind of sort of remember the snapshots of it, and they were
Yeah.
trying to use all of that to work. And something that we've seen quite a bit in our work is also the fact that that person with 30 years of experience that you mentioned leaves the company, and now good luck with everything that they didn't
Uh-huh.
put down on paper,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that and even if they do, for whatever altruistic reason they decide to document, or for whatever mandate they decide to document the knowledge and know-hows, it is usually decontextualized in a sense that it's, really boiled down to the
Yeah.
very, very boring skeleton of that knowledge that that person had. Is that essentially the problem you're solving, and how are you going about it?
So it's interesting. I ended up not going with, even though that was the original inspiration for this, I really ended up not going with a B2B model for lots of reasons. Originally, when I was thinking about bringing the hardware components in, it was important to me from a data privacy perspective that, like, organizations don't have your brain data. I don't feel like that's something people are going to sign up for. And so, it was important to me from the beginning there that it was individuals, it was their data. The example I spoke about where somebody was at an organization for 30 years, they have all this embedded knowledge, we lose it. That's all absolutely true. Also, depending on the industry and the space people are working, there's the opposite end where people are in a job for like a couple of years. Like, after 4 years, someone's like, why were you there so long? Especially in tech, right? And so we have this problem at that scale too, where if I build a system that's kind of mimicking the way that you store this information, your memory, your attention, your creative thinking, and you leave the organization, and that data stays there, you have to start from scratch again. That really doesn't make sense to me as a model if you're doing it in this more individualized way. And so for me, I went this B2C route to start with the idea that people have their own Recollect account. And then I think eventually an organization can have a system that hooks into that, right? So we use lots of sort of graphs in our work right now. We use large language models as well, of course, but we are thinking about this as a way of like plugging it into the system, right? Where you have this context from the business, you have your own personal stuff that you know. The tricky part, and we haven't done this yet, is like, how do you keep those really separate, right? Like if I'm at an organization and I'm on my laptop and I'm reading things, I'm learning things that are not super specific to the organization, right? Like it's not private information, not financial data. That's still my knowledge. Like I need to keep that when I go, right? Like it's still in my head, really. And so it's tricky how you disentangle those two things. So the problem for us right now that we're focusing on with consumers is really, even if they're not doing this work, you asked if I had like a side thing or side interest or something I was working on, right? Like lots of people have those right now. So even if I'm not working on something for my job, I'm working on something for the side. I'm still doing this creative thinking. I'm still putting my ideas together. I'm kind of always doing that. And so we're kind of trying to help people get those ideas more easily right now. And you can kind of think about it as a better memory or an extended memory, but it's really the attention, the memory, and then the creative connection part. And I think you need all three of those to really enable that part.
You're taking me back to my first philosophy course. I was coming from chemistry when I got into cog sci, and I remember the first paper I wrote was on embodied cognition.
Yes. Oh, so good. Um, yeah. And I don't think we need to be fully embodied. I think there's a big debate about that right now, especially with the way that large language models are evolving. I'm sort of in the camp that, you should have more information, but it doesn't have to be fully embodied. In part because information is not fully embodied at the moment. So there's a sort of extended mind fork, which is like Andy Clark's camp. And if you go that direction, then it's like, even my pen and paper is an extended mind. We're already there, and that's not embodied, right? Like I guess I wrote it, but that's not necessarily part of my embodied cognition on a minute by minute basis. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but yes, I love
Um,
the other perspectives and stuff.
I'm glad that you brought up the extended one. So this is kind of a personal view, but the way I think of, so as a UX researcher, a lot of what I do feeds into accessibility, right? And inclusion. And a lot of what I think in terms of accessibility is rooted in the extended mind, because everything, just like you said, pen and paper, everything is an external scaffolding that amplifies or supports what we're able to do, and it's just the level of dependency on, if I have a memory related issue, maybe depend on that calendar and reminders and sticky notes a lot more than all of us, but all of us use it,
Yeah.
right? So I love that. That's my, I guess, my way of thinking of the spectrum without a label necessarily. It's just the dependency on the external part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a huge accessibility problem in a lot of this work in terms of, um, you know, at a base level, people have different like ability to remember things. They have better short-term memory. They have better long-term memory. They have all these differences. There's individual differences among everybody. Um, but also there's differences and I think that's diminishing, but like access to the technology that helps support this, right? Like 20 years ago, much fewer people in the world had computers, right? Or access to the internet. That has changed so much. So I think we saw this sort of like rising tide there, where more and more people have access to the internet. They have access to devices, um, and we're seeing all sorts of really interesting things from there. But if we start to uh, create tools and systems that only support some kinds of work or some kinds of people, then on top of that, then we've got again this like big diverse, like this huge disparity in terms of like what people can access. So from my perspective, this ability to do this cognitive work is important already. It's going to become a lot more important. Or we, take a left and do universal basic income, but I don't know. I'm not in control of those policies. And so when we think about like even computers, even having access to a machine at a young age, right, is a way of augmenting someone cognitively. We're giving them a skill and a way of thinking that's different than you were born with, right? Like than we evolved with. And so another piece for me in all of this is like with the wearable piece, with the non-wearable piece, like making sure that this is something that everybody can get a hold of, and that it's not something that becomes again this like because I feel like we've gotten better. I don't want it to go the other direction. Where now it's like now we're pulling these things apart again.
I'm curious to explore the relationship between what you're doing and this trend that has been going on in the market around second brain. And now we are
Mm-hmm.
also talking about third brain. But before we get to that, so there is a very interesting. I was listening to a podcast by Huberman recently,
Yeah.
where he brought in a person who was talking about interactions of cognition and language, because those are in principle different things, but language is what we use to interface with other humans as we are exploring our cognitive abilities. That is a very interesting topic to get into for probably a different session, since you're focusing on individuals for now. But that's also how we preserve our own cognition so that we can reuse it and reconstruct it and synthesize new things. And I think that's generally the direction that you're interested in, because when you're talking about creativity, to me, the definition is I know A and I know B. What's an interesting overlap of these two on a super basic level, right? So, um, and what you're trying to do, or what you're doing, is using language understanding and generation and those type of technologies to essentially facilitate that activity. And very interesting things that have happened is that 5-6 years ago, or maybe a little more, all we could hope to do was sentiment analysis with
Yeah.
language. And then about 5 years ago, everything changed with transformers, and we've been doing a lot of more interesting things. And all of a sudden, in the past 2 years or so, with generatively pre-trained models, we're
Mhm.
seeing emergent behavior, emergent multitask capabilities in these models, uh, which are becoming very, very interesting, because for language to be the interface of cognition, now it looks like language is becoming also the interface of intelligence in machines with these changes. Do you agree? Is this train of thought consistent with what you've seen?
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna like sort of like hop around in what you just said, and if I get lost, you can find me in there. So I think first of all, the like a big goal for us as in the stuff that we're building is that you can put your ideas together and you can communicate them. I think it's incredibly important to be able to take the stuff that's in your head, put it in a format that another human can understand, and then give it to them, right? And now I think with some of the stuff that's been happening with the foundation models, I'll call them, right? Now it's, can you take the stuff in your head, put it in the right format, and give it to the machine? And so it's not that different, except that in the human to human interaction, that the big magic there for me in terms of creative thinking is that, like, yes, I have idea A, I have idea B. What are some interesting connections between those two things? That's this divergent thinking. Can I take things that are more disparate and find interesting connections with them and then build on top of that? That actually happens more when you're in conversation with other people. So people's creative thinking, you can have this moment where you're, out wandering the woods. This park here I mentioned, I spent a lot of time during the pandemic walking around alone. That's really helpful to just sort of let your ideas germinate. But then talking to somebody makes it so clear what you're actually trying to say, and then they say something and it changes what you're thinking. And so I think this like conversational piece with a human is really important, and I can see now why it's relevant for these sort of new foundation models we're talking about here. And I had 3 points and I've already lost myself in them. What was your other part of your question, or what was the main piece of it?
But I think you touched on all of them. Like, really, where I was trying to go was that, as humans, we use language as an interface
Right.
for our cognition to interact with other people. But now we are really in this threesome with machines and interaction with other people, because we use language to interact with other people. But we no longer, it seems very soon, will need formal language to talk to machines. So machines can be part of this conversation with just natural language as the interface, because they're very good at translating it into formal language and interfacing with other systems.
Yeah, I think we're going to hit a stalling point there for a couple of reasons, though. I think one, I heard this explanation. I don't remember where I heard it, but it was great. So we can think of language as a lower dimensional representation of something some people call mentalese. So like your mental work that you're doing in your head isn't always informal language. And so language is this way to like reduce this to a way that we can communicate it. And then, transformer models are taking all of this stuff and actually, encoding it into this lower dimensional space. That's exactly what they're doing as well. So there are some parallels there in terms of like, what is language? What is it actually doing? But something I think we really don't understand, especially as we see these emergent properties of the foundation models, is like, what is being represented, right? And we don't know that in humans either, really. We don't understand what this representation is. I think the next couple of years, I'm very interested to see the research on these models to understand what is the representation. And so if we move forward and this thing, speaks like a human, it can converse like a human, and so we treat it that way, and we think, oh, it has the same representations as a human would, and we're wrong there, then we're going to get some really weird results from that. I think as we like start to extrapolate that and say, okay, we don't understand what my representation is of New York's geography. We can't really like pull that out in any way, and the models are representing something else. So I think that we do have a facility now to like convey information to these machine learning models, to these foundation models, but it's not the same as if I tell you something and then you've got this rich representation that's unique to you, and you're attaching that, and you're sort of, if you look at like the concept formation literature, basically like new information comes in, it goes into these clusters. If it's different enough, it makes a new cluster, right? And so until we understand the representations in these models, I think we're not going to get that kind of traction.
Yeah. Yeah, so I definitely agree with what you're saying, but from a pragmatic point of view, I think there is a way to make it work, right? Because one of the interesting things that these large language models are capable of doing is, the chain of thought prompting, where you can essentially set them up to come up with thoughts, act on it, and then come up with the next thought, act on it, etc., until they can. And one thing that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is So usually, you can set them up to use tools like, the language model can call a search engine to get some results that it needs. It can call a relational database and, ask it to do some aggregation and bring it back. And I'm taking this a little further and thinking, wait, what if the large language model also used its human operators as one of these tools to
Yeah.
provide further information? Because what your criticism is absolutely correct, that it doesn't have all the necessary context, but it can get context from the tools, including the human operator. Like it can ask follow-up questions
Yeah.
to understand better what was it that, because that's how we humans communicate. I say something and you're like, well, I don't think so, but we start talking about it and then we find a middle ground because both of us recontextualized what the other person was thinking. And I think when I'm talking about this three-way human machine interactions, uh,
Mm.
that's sort of what I'm thinking about. That it is facilitating the conversation that you and I have, but also it is acting as this third brain that is
Yeah.
keeping track of the conversation and all the nuances that is happening in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. And we're seeing this with the way the reinforcement learning human in the loop pieces, right? So we're bringing humans into this process. That's for model training. That's not just, every day working with it. But yeah, like it really depends on how far you take. Like if you take humans completely out of the loop and you think, okay, we're just creating AGIs and this will all do the things and we won't be involved, and then like that will fall apart, I think. But I love this hybrid of human machine is very interesting. And I also wonder if, sort of like a mediator, like a third person, right? In conversation, it might be interesting to have this other perspective being a machine. They can kind of pull out interesting pieces from each side of a discussion and be able to sort of reflect those back at least, which I think we can do pretty well with it, and not like change the conversation, try to stay neutral, but like, can we just be that mediator, moderator person?
Yeah, it's been happening in my R&D team quite a bit recently that I come up with an idea and I'm like, what if we did this?
Mhm.
And everybody's like, what are you talking about? So then I'll go back and talk to our system. And after 15 minutes, it prints a document that I send to our team, and everybody's like, "Oh, okay, I see what
Yeah.
you mean." And if we could make this real time, then it's phenomenal. Like a third person involved in every Slack conversation we have, that is
Yeah.
listening to everybody and mediating, just translating that Alice said this, that's what she meant because of this other note that she has in this other document, etc., etc.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I often wish I had this as a human in life. I really I sort of jokingly will say like, "Oh, this person on my team speaks human, like they can help with this," because I myself really struggle, and I think it's part of why I created the product I created is that I have all this stuff, and then it's hard for me to check like, am I being insane? Like, is this just way off? And if I can't communicate that to another human well enough, they can't make that. They can't like give me the feedback that I need on that. So yeah, I would love to try whatever you're building. That sounds really cool.
This conversation is really kind of walking me through all my PhD courses. Now I'm thinking of linguistics and really thinking of like the Grice's manners, right? With like quality, quantity, relevance, and manner. And I feel like even just talking to GPT-4, it it takes it back to me. It's like, well, I wasn't clear. I wasn't concise. This is what I violated. And once I revised that prompt, all of a sudden the result is so much more valuable, so much more relevant. So ultimately it's refining the way I put the information forward. And that, I mean, not a lot of people are up at 4 a.m. So GPT-4 is becoming my conversational partner at 4 a.m. I must confess.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I worry a little bit. So the prompting I know is really exciting right now. People are like, "Oh," I worry a little bit about that way that changes the way that we're thinking and the way that we're speaking or the language we're using. If we know, like, it's as if I don't know, if you have children or if you anybody in your life really that you're trying to explain something to that doesn't like really do the same thing you do or like isn't quite in the same space. it can be difficult to like have a theory of mind enough to know like what do they know, what more information do I need to give them. And I think part of interacting with GPT-4 is teaching us all that like, oh, it doesn't have context, right? Like it literally doesn't. It's just this very global model. And so if I'm like, if I say something even that happens more recently, which is another problem, but if it doesn't have the context, then it's hard to have that conversation. I have to be really explicit and say, here's all this extra information so I can help you to understand what I need from you as a conversational partner. I think a really interesting space will be once we get you know, individuals who have some of this information in a way that's accessible to these models, right? And so if we're having a conversation, it's still, unfortunately not up at 4 a.m. unless you can do this async, which I think is cool too. You can Slack people and whatnot. But if you can have these representations of what these individuals know, and then you have something like GPT or some chat thing as a layer, and I really, yeah, now that we're like going back and forth, like this translator, right? Of like, oh yeah, you can rephrase it for this person, but even what if I said something like actual translation is a great example. If I say something in a language you don't understand, we're able to translate that now really easily, and that's how a lot of this work started. But I wonder if there's a space of translating like other aspects of that to make it more understandable to a certain person, right? We could personalize that conversation really easily. Um, that might be fun.
You're gonna love what we're building then.
Yay!
Uh, so what you're describing is very interesting because it requires adding context to the conversation, but also setting up the system not to be reactive. Like the problem with ChatGPT and the fact that you have to do so much prompt engineering, even though it's pretty good at following instructions. GPT-4 is even better. Is that it is largely reactive. It just waits for you to say something and then reacts to that.
Yeah.
While if you set it up right and interface it with, for example, a logical reasoner, then what you could do is to introduce a concept of information completeness. For example, does it have the information that is necessary to recontextualize and push the conversation forward or not? And what does it mean for this conversation to have enough context, right? And then you can start thinking about, okay, what other systems need to be connected to this system to have enough context for that 4 a.m. conversation, right? So one of the I know we are running almost out of time, so I want to touch on the very last topic, before we start to wrap up, which is I think you made a conscious choice to. I believe your system. I haven't seen your product, unfortunately, but I think it has a visual component, like sort of like Miro, where you can sort of like visualize your thoughts almost and their relationships to each other. And that's the approach that we took in our product as well. Initially, we had these, thought visualizations that we did for people on the technical topics. But we ran into the problem that not a lot of people were thinking that way. Like they had a hard time thinking in a graphical way. Like it was way more comfortable for them to think linearly. And I think that's why chat gpt, I mean, we were going to talk about ux a little more, but we didn't go into it too much. But like the engine behind chat gpt existed for almost a year, less than a year, right? But then all of a sudden they put this very linear user experience in front of it and it blew up. Everybody was like, oh my god, where this has been. And that tells me, and because of that we just completely abandoned the visual navigation in our system. So how are you thinking about that? Like what is, like, just to wrap up this conversation, I guess, almost, what are some of the nuances around ux that you've seen, and this is a specific choice of representing knowledge and recollection visually? Talk us through that a bit.
Yeah. So there's, I guess, like I have a few different answers to the why the visual piece is important. The plainest answer is that's the way I think. It's really important to me. I cannot think another way. When I was coming up with Recollect, again, pretty deep into the pandemic, I had this whiteboard behind me. I had pictures of the whiteboard that I would put on my computer. I had stuff everywhere. And without that, I cannot. I carry a Remarkable with me everywhere, and I have to draw things out for the team. Like I really, am a heavy user of that spatial information. So for me, I couldn't use a system that's very linear. There's this great quote. I think it's Barbara Tversky, and she said something like, "When the mind gets too full, you have to start to externalize those thoughts." Right. So like we can't actually reason about that many different things in our head, and so what that constraint is up for debate, right? So if it's four, right, that's the visual part. I don't know conceptually, really, but we start really quickly to reach a ceiling where we can't really keep all this stuff, even when we're talking and I'm like, oh, I had like four thoughts and I went and I keep moving my hands, right? Like for me, I'm sort of like, I should have written down a little like map for myself, right? As you were asking the question. So I think that there's good evidence from the like more on the cognitive science side that you really can't reason about the stuff. You can't keep it in your mind. You really need some external piece of it eventually. One thing I'm so curious about as you're speaking too is that if we took people that were, let's say, just reading, right? Like 7, 6, 5 year olds that hadn't had a lot of experience with linear documents or chat or any of these systems we've already built, and we asked them to do this, I suspect it would be a little bit more all over the place and they might struggle. So I think we might have trained ourselves because of the constraints of the computers to do this very linear thing. And almost immediately you run into an issue, even with ChatGPT, which is you need to have multi-threaded conversations now because you're like, I have to go back over here and then over here. And it's really hard then to untangle that. And so I really do wonder. And so for me, I don't think we'll give up on the visual component. One thing that was important though that we did, and it's a decision we keep making, is that we don't have arrows or lines connecting things. And so even that, like adding that structure to it, the most structure I think we add is like this visual grouping of items. So you can kind of put things together that go together. And that's a utility that makes sense to me. But when you start to like, this line goes to here, there's lots of like mind mapping tools that do this. That becomes extremely rigid. And so I guess I'm way in the other camp where like I need maximum flexibility to say, this stuff actually, it fits this way kind of right now. If I'm thinking about this later, it might be totally different, and that's fine. So I think of our visual component in our product as a scratch pad. Like this is a space I can externalize this work. I can put it together. It probably isn't the last piece of the output. The last piece of the output ends up being something more linear. We have a document editor in there right now, where however you're communicating that to another human is probably not this like hazier, like middle space, I guess. Yeah, so I'm still in camp. Some spatial components are important. I actually find there's another piece that I'm really excited at. Someday somebody please finish this AR like grand experiment. Because there's good evidence too that the way we think is very spatial. So information being in a certain location is really important, and it's not a flat rectangle at all. And so we're missing a whole dimension of depth with these. We're missing the ability to move them around. Like, can I place these ideas on my table in a certain place? So I'm hoping we kind of push that direction more, and that brings it back.
I have a question that kind of takes us back to the beginning, and it's a bit of a selfish one with the same idea of helping, well, myself and all my students. If we like, you kind of really are truly the perfect model of living at the bridge of you care about what's needed for someone. So user research,
Yeah.
the technology behind AI, ML, and the background from academia. So if we think of, 20 years from now in this intersection between UX, data sci, or ML, what would you say are the core skills or trends or needs that we have a blind spot to, that for someone to still make it in the field, they need to have to live at this intersection that's becoming the norm rather than the exception?
First of all, I'm really glad it's becoming the norm. Um, Having been this weirdo mashup of a person for so long now, I'm like, this is my moment. In all seriousness, I think that one thing I'm really worried about as we move forward is like I'm not that old. I haven't been around that long, but I've seen this progression from you really have to understand these models to implement them in like cafe even, right? Like you're just like really like lower level to now it's like download a thing, put a prompt in, you get a thing happening, which is fantastic for letting people use this kind of technology. But if I was somebody today and I say like, okay, this is actually going to be really important, the way we interact with these systems generally, it's probably not going to be large language models in 5 years, honestly, it'll be something else. But thinking about like not in the code, but two levels down, like really understanding fundamentally, even at a theoretical level, what the stuff is doing, right? And then mapping that. Like, I think something I do really well is say, like, I understand the machine learning models and how they're working, right? Like, I understand how a transformer works. I understand what the like trade-offs are. I understand all the layers. I also understand humans and how their mind works to some extent, right? And so that kind of like dual tracking where you can say, this is how they're similar, this is how they're different. You can only really get that if you know at least a level lower than just like this is the easiest thing to implement piece. And that's where I think it gets incredibly interesting, because if you can start to think about, okay, this is the in a language model, right? Like we could take off layers even and do interesting things. But for somebody in the field today, moving forward, I would say get a firm grasp on how this thing is actually working, whatever the thing du jour is that year or that 5 years. And then keep understanding, keep fresh on what do we know about the way the human mind works, because that's always changing as well. And that's like a bigger task to stay abreast of both of those spaces. But if you combine those, then I think you have a real way of letting humans interact with the technology. You have a way eventually of like plugging this stuff in. I think is going to be super exciting, right? If I think about this idea of, for me, someday wearable, we're talking, we have some information about your attention. We bring that attention into the models, right? Like if you actually understand the models well enough to bring that in, you can start to really change things quickly and make that like more of this like dual interaction. So my advice is like stay broad. Don't come under pressure to be like, I have to be this like very small thing. Like everything, there's too much information. You're not going to be able to stay on top of everything and be an expert in everything. But like, keep that like multidisciplinary piece going, because I think it's so important.
Definitely. I've been going around telling people in the past couple of years that learning to learn is the most important skill, regardless of where you are and what you do, because most probably, and it is becoming more relevant this year and past year, because the things that I knew last week are probably out of date this week, right? Especially if you're working in the language modeling space. So I'm going forward, it's just going to get worse. So the only super skill that you could have is just the ability to quickly learn and absorb, and not be married to anything. But let's wrap up. I usually like to ask, what are the verdicts and takeaway from the conversation we had. So Roxana, what is the thing that you're going to think about differently after this conversation? And Alice, you've been thinking about these things very deeply for the past few years, but what is something that you think people should think differently that you were not thinking about it that way a few years ago? Roxana?
Good question. There's a lot I'm going to think about, but this conversation comes at an interesting time for me, and I'll reveal why maybe in our next recording. But the bridging and the value that academia brings into it, I think, particularly in the past year or 2 years, there's been so much, difficulty for people from academia to find a new job, so many layoffs, people discouraged to make that transition. And the reality I think there's a lot of value that can make a huge impact, particularly as we move from user research to humanity centered design, like that bigger scale. I think it requires both plus the technology. So I'm going to take that as a positive note.
Awesome. And the question for me, I think, was how has my thinking changed in the last few years?
And specifically the part that you think more people should think differently, the way you're thinking it evolved.
Yeah. And I guess it's like a lesson we've already learned. But as I've gotten into this, I realized how important like I think things right now are swinging more towards this global, like these larger language models, this global, like multi-ability systems. I think that I want more people to keep thinking about how do we model individuals, and then how do we use those models of individuals to really work with this stuff. And I think some of that's getting lost right now. I think that's a thread for me that I've kind of tried to hold on to. And one argument people make a lot is like, oh, it's computationally very expensive. Like you wouldn't want to, like, I'm not going to train a large language model on an individual and have every customer have that right now, right? But the rate at which the computational piece is changing in terms of the hardware, in terms of how much things cost, is also incredible. And so I'm hoping that people kind of they're looking to smaller models now, but like keeping that like human piece, like we're actually modeling human behavior. We're modeling individuals. They're very different. Keep that in mind as you're building things.
Definitely. Something that you said on the coordination call about this specific question was your observation about how much trouble people have interacting with their own knowledge and how they consume their knowledge. And that really speaks to me because sort of the change that I'm interested to see in the world is how these large language models are going to facilitate better negotiations. Like this negotiation could be, a product owner talking to a developer, a salesperson talking to a customer, uh, like literally a couple trying to resolve an issue they have, etc. Right? Because the large language models might not be knowledge bases, but they're fantastic language interfaces,
Mhm.
linguistic interfaces, as Wolfram put it recently. So I'm very interested to see what positive impact people create using these language models, specifically as it comes to interaction between humans. So this concept of third brain is very interesting for me to see how it will impact how we work together and how we live together. So thank you so much for watching another episode of Deep Random Talks. Hopefully, and I'm sure you've got a lot of interesting things to take away from this and uh, think about humanity, as Roxana put it, and both Alice as well, as you build with these large language models. Thank you so much for joining us today.